start by just kind of talking a little bit about what I do. I recognize you guys might not be able to see this very well, so I will try and kind of cover all the points that are on there. So as Courtney kind of mentioned, I'm a certified sex therapist. So that's kind of something, an additional training that we do in terms of becoming a psychologist. A little bit about my background. I actually started way back, I don't want to date myself, but 18, 20 years ago, I started working at the University of Alberta at the Sexual Assault Center. That's where I developed my passion for being a psychologist. And so since then, I've been kind of more or less working in the field of sexual health since then. As a psychologist, I did an extra year of training in some of these kind of key areas. So in working with sex therapy, you kind of deal with everything from sexual desire issues to challenges with sexual performance. Also deal with trauma, sexual abuse, sexual assault. In addition to that, sexual compulsions. So sex addiction has become a lot more popular, not necessarily in a good way, but it's at least more understood. So dealing with pornography addiction, sexual addictions, sexual concerns with regards to aging. So oftentimes we used to kind of have this idea that after a certain age, people's sex drives kind of stop, they dry up, people no longer desire sex. Not true. One of the biggest, I guess, concerns or increases in STIs has actually been in the seniors population. So now in senior citizens' homes, yeah, there needs to be a little bit more education on STIs and safe sex. So interesting in terms of the different things that I get to work with. I also do a lot of work with sexual identity. So people exploring their sexual identity, figuring out what it is for themselves, working with people dealing with gender, transgender, different things like that. So kind of a wide gamut of things. So nothing is ever really boring in my job, which is kind of fun because every hour is a little bit different. Obviously, I also work with relationship issues, so sex and relationships tend to go hand in hand, not always required, but they do tend to go hand in hand. So these are just kind of some of the issues that I deal with in terms of relationships. I also have a specialty in trauma as well. And so, again, there's kind of a lot of overlap between those kind of three areas. What I want to talk to you guys about tonight, or what I've been asked to come and talk to you guys about, is kind of three things. So one is sexual health. The other one is kind of how that ties into healthy relationships. And within that, also kind of talking a little bit about consent, because consent's pretty key. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. As we're going, if you do have questions, and you're not shy, feel free to raise your hand or shout them out. I'm fine with that. I'll be sticking around afterwards for as long as you want, so feel free to pick my brain on any number of topics. This, in many ways, will be kind of an overview of some of those pieces. All right? Everybody can hear me okay? All right, awesome. So starting off with sex. Sex and sexuality is a part of who we are. I feel like I'm missing a slide here, which I might have deleted by accident. We're all wired for sex. That's a part of who we are. It's a fundamental part of who we are. And it's something that develops very much across the lifespan. Even when you think about little kids and we think about healthy sex education, little kids are figuring out their body parts, they're figuring out who they are, they're curious, kind of puberty comes along, all kinds of hormones. And really kind of after that, we kind of move into sexual development. It's not the same as other forms of development in the sense that it often has to be something that we're a little bit more deliberate with. We're kind of exploring that, figuring that out. In North America, we don't tend to really talk about sex a whole lot. So there are sex ed classes, although they tend to be a lot more biology related. At least when I was in school, there wasn't really a whole lot on healthy sex or what good sex looks like and consent and different things like that. So what I find, generally speaking, is a lot of people enter into adulthood in their early 20s with not a whole lot of information that's necessarily accurate. There's a lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings or misinformed information about sex and sexuality. For some people, depending upon their backgrounds, they might not even connect to themselves as being a sexual being until they're in a significant relationship or in their 20s, or I've worked with some people well into their 30s or 40s that haven't really figured out who they are as a sexual person or really connected to that. there's lots of things that influence our views and ideas on sex. So, and that's kind of important. So who we are, family, society, our background and our experiences, friends. Friends often tend to be somebody that you're more likely to talk to about sex as opposed to family members. Not always, but that's been my experience. And with friends, generally speaking, if people are going to talk about sex, usually it's kind of talking about either positive experiences or talking in generalities. I've had a lot of clients, a lot of females in their kind of late 20s who've come and they've been like, I think I'm the only one who's having painful sexual intercourse, and I can't talk about it with my friends because I think there's something wrong with me. So a lot of people kind of carry questions or challenges that they might have with sex and sexuality very privately. Now the internet is a great thing, and so that's definitely helping a lot of people get more and more information. Again, there can be some misconceptions out there, so it can be hard to always get good information, but that's definitely something that is becoming more accessible. So recognizing all of these different things that shape our views on sexuality and who we are as sexual beings, there can be different things that people have to work through. So if, for example, you grow up in a family where there's no physical affection, or people talk about sex, or you grew up in a culture where sex is kind of seen as being bad or wrong, or there's a religious belief where sex should be only after marriage or different things like that, it can definitely kind of create, sometimes it's very helpful for people, and other times it can create some challenges or barriers in terms of navigating some of those different things, because it can be hard to talk about. And with that, the other thing that can sometimes happen is if we don't have a chance to really explore ourselves sexually, get to know our own selves sexually, when we get into relationships, there can be a huge jump or a huge shock where it's like we're going from 0 to 100. All of a sudden I'm doing things that I'm just not really sure what's going on. So even just psychologically being able to kind of catch up with what's going on physically can sometimes be a big jump for a lot of people. So kind of recognizing that and recognizing that it's complicated, these are kind of some myths, not all of them. We could be here for a couple of hours talking about all the misconceptions that exist out there. But some of the kind of big ones that I come across, men always want sex, regardless of the relationship that they're in, whether it's same-sex or straight relationships. Not true. Men get tired as well. Men get stressed. Men can have low desire, and women can have high desire, and vice versa. So it's definitely not a situation where they always want sex. Great sex is when both partners orgasm at the same time. So sure, that can happen, but when we kind of look at it, the odds, so to speak, you can certainly practice that skill and work towards that, but the odds are probably about the same as winning the lottery. Maybe a little less, depending upon couples who are very in tune with each other, but generally speaking, that's not something that we can aim for on a consistent basis. So that's really important to be aware of, because a lot of people will kind of bank that as, well, this is good if we both orgasm at the same time. Men want more sex than women. Again, not necessarily the case. There are some women who also have very high sex drives. There are some women in partnerships who want sex far more than their partners. So not necessarily the case. There's no research necessarily supporting that one gender or certain individuals want sex more than the others. The other thing that also the research kind of shows us is most of us throughout life will go through periods where we don't desire sex as much. And that can be influenced by a lot of things: stress, could be job changes, it could be grief, loss, it could be being preoccupied with other things. So Netflix is a huge killer of desire. If you want to watch that next episode, there's a lot of different things that can definitely impact desire for both people. Men and women reach sexual peaks at different ages. So this used to be a big thing, right? Guys at their peak in their kind of early 20s, women way into their late 30s or 40s. That has largely been debunked, so there's not really any biological standings behind that. I think the best that we can kind of connect with is that as women age, overall they tend to become more comfortable with who they are with their bodies, they're more confident in themselves, they're more likely to explore themselves sexually. So that's where you might see a peak later on, but it's not an actual biological peak. And so what we find is when women are able to kind of explore that and connect with their sexuality at younger and younger ages, their drives and interests are similar to you. Right? And so when you think about that, I think the normalization, let's say, for example, even around masturbation with guys, that's kind of a, it's not so much of do you masturbate, right? It's more like, so how long have you been masturbating? For women, we still very much have a lot of taboo around that, but that masturbation self-pleasure is equally important for them. In many ways, it's a key way in which we discover for ourselves what we like sexually. After a certain age, sex is no longer important or desired. So, as I was mentioning earlier, not true. We have a lot of seniors who are very sexually active. What's interesting about seniors and people kind of post-retirement is the research shows that they actually have longer sex. So their overall, I guess, sexual encounters are longer, partly probably because they're not trying to squeeze it in after work and jobs. So, a little bit more time than the rest of us. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So it's not so much that we have to pack all this in when we're younger. We can certainly experience that when we're older as well. Challenges with impotence and erectile dysfunction only happens in older men. So this is not true, and I guess some interesting things that are coming up right now in the research is because of some of the challenges that exist around internet pornography and use of different things like that, we're actually seeing in young adults and even in the adolescent teenage population, where more guys than men are coming forward with issues around erectile dysfunction and being able to maintain an erection and different things like that. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation, but essentially what's kind of going on there is it's not necessarily that pornography is bad. It can be a great tool, especially when it comes to self-pleasure. But one of the challenges is if it is being used too much, our brain gets used to it and it gets overstimulated. And so when it comes to kind of having sex with another living, breathing person, our brains don't work the same way. So that's a lot of the reasons why some of those challenges are existing. So certainly, people in relationships can experience a decrease in sex and desire for sex. We'll talk about that in terms of that kind of coupling and just kind of falling into kind of routines. But there's nothing to support the fact that people in relationship can't have good, enjoyable, passionate sex on a regular basis, whatever that means to them, right? So that might mean once a week, but it might mean a couple times a week, it could be once a month. Interesting, a couple years ago, there was one research study that came out that actually kind of looked at people in relationship versus single people in terms of who was having more sex. And what they found is that in relationships, people are still having more sex as compared to people who are single. So it's definitely not dead in the relationship, and it doesn't have to become boring as time goes on either. The last one is, in a relationship, you should have sex X amount of times, days, weeks, months, like in terms of that frequency. So again, frequency is, there's nothing that says how much or how often you should have sex for that to be normal or healthy. It's really hard to do research in this field because we're relying on a lot of self-report, and not everybody wants to necessarily talk to us about their sex lives or what they're doing. Generally speaking, though, in terms of, at the end of the day, what we're aiming for is what's satisfying in a relationship. So I've worked with some individuals, in their relationships, they're having sex every day. I've worked with other people, as a couple, they're having sex once a week, once a month, once every couple of weeks. So really what it comes down to is it's more what works for both partners, and you're always kind of navigating that and negotiating that. The other thing that I always kind of ask people too is what we define as sex, right? So hopefully by the end of tonight, we'll also be kind of thinking about sex a bit broader, so not just intercourse or not just oral sex, but kind of looking at sex in terms of all the different things that we can do in terms of kissing, touching, making out all of those different things. So one of the things that I always like to talk about is what is normal is not always necessarily healthy. So when you're reading studies or if you're looking at stuff on the internet, or you might, Psychology Today maybe is not something that you guys necessarily subscribe to. I do, obviously. But in that, you'll often see like this is kind of what normal people are doing, or this is kind of what the average. So normal is really just meaning what the majority of people in whatever study is being reported, what the results are. And it's always kind of helpful to be aware of that normal isn't necessarily always healthy, right? So an example here, in some populations, unprotected sex is the norm, right? But we can probably generally all agree that it's not necessarily always a healthy thing, especially depending upon, if you're having, engaging in sexual activity with multiple partners, different things like that. So one of the first pieces, and to me this is really essential, is before we can really have good, successful sex with other people, we have to know ourselves. And so we have to know ourselves sexually. We also kind of have to have a sense of who we are in terms of our kind of sexual identity. So this is just kind of a graphic. Sex identity is becoming broader and broader and broader, right? So, we've kind of moved beyond a few terms in terms of, heterosexual, gay, we've got lesbian, we've got bisexual, we have sexual fluidity. There are people who identify as being asexual. And so how you identify yourself as a sexual person is an important part of who you are. This is also something that's evolving over time. So I've also known a lot of people who, later on in their relationships, they might, decide, let's explore open relationships, or, I thought this is, what I identified as. I thought I wanted a monogamous relationship, but now I'm finding actually that I identify more as having a polyamorous relationship. So identity is also something that, on the one hand, there's parts of our identity that we can't shift, but sometimes what we'll find is as we get to know ourselves more and more and more, particularly when we're exploring sex and sexuality, sometimes those things do shift. Generally what doesn't shift is who we're attracted to. That being said, what we can also find is that we grow up, we still exist very much in a heterosexual world, and so most of us go with that default of, well, I must be straight. That's kind of what I've grown up with. So as you get older, you might find that, wow, maybe I am attracted to somebody of the same sex, and that's, surprising. So we still see that, and there's certainly more people who are what we would call sexually fluid or pansexual, where that gender piece isn't necessarily as important as what we think it is. And so there was, you may or may not have heard of Kinsley way back in the 70s. He kind of had this scale that he developed, which was basically, I think it's fairly limited nowadays, but he did kind of talk about this idea of, if we looked at, just these two variables of heterosexuality and homosexuality, a lot of people kind of fall somewhere within that. Some of us are way over here, and some of us are way over here. And nowadays, like I said, we understand that that's much more broad in terms of our understanding of that. But oftentimes, there certainly is a lot more movement than we might even necessarily think. And so certainly as we get older and develop that part of ourselves, we might find this movement. The other pieces about sexual identity that we often don't necessarily think about, beyond kind of the label of who we're attracted to, is kind of looking at arousal templates. So the other thing that we know is that there's going to be something unique about us that may or may not be the same as other people, the things that kind of fire us up, the things that turn us on. And so that's partly something that we have to figure out and explore within ourselves. Obviously, being with partners, we can kind of discover different things that we like or that we don't like. It's generally something that can also very much shift over time. So just because you like something today doesn't mean that 5 years from now you're going to love that. So it's kind of one of those things that we're constantly getting to know about ourselves. But there are certain kind of templates, so to speak, that we can kind of look at. Generally speaking, one of the things that we know is a little bit different between men and women, although not always. Men, just generally speaking, the way their sexual arousal templates tend to work is they're a lot more visual. So they're more likely to kind of experience some kind of arousal or attraction based upon visual stimuli. Women are also, they also experience that, but women are also a little bit more relational, so that's kind of another component to that. They're kind of looking for, once I walk up and talk to you, do I feel like I'm talking to somebody that I can connect with? And so we do see that. I want to kind of clarify, I'm not suggesting that men don't care about those things, because that relational piece is equally as important. But when we're kind of looking at some of those things around sexual arousal templates, that can sometimes be a little bit of a difference. And that's important, especially when we're dealing with things like foreplay. Again, if somebody's more visual, one partner might prefer, lingerie, or they might kind of like how you're dressed, or different things like that. Where the other partner is a little bit more like, I'm more in the mood after quality time, after we, spend time together and have fun and do something special. So in whatever relationship you're in, it's always good to kind of try and get a sense of what is this person's arousal template and how does that kind of line up with mine, because you kind of have to bring the two together in order for it to be a good experience for both parties. The other piece of that is likes, dislikes, and interests. So again, that's something that can change. Figuring those things out is all through exploring and being curious. And so we have to also kind of be curious with where those personal boundaries are. So not stretching beyond those personal boundaries, so kind of knowing what those personal boundaries are for each person is equally as important. That's kind of the sexual identity piece. And that's extremely important. To know ourselves is what is needed to allow ourselves to really enjoy sex in all of its gloriousness. We kind of need that piece. If we don't know who we are, then it's hard to let our partners know what we like, what we don't like, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. And that's really essential because as much as you can, I mean, there's a lot of information out there now on, how to facilitate orgasm, how to, give the best oral sex, all of these different things. And they're good techniques, they're good strategies, and there's some good information. But every person is very individual, so you're still going to have to figure out what works for this specific person, this partner that I'm with. And so that's kind of key there in terms of, we can't just kind of learn that without knowing ourselves first. We have to be, the goal, ideally, is to be an expert on ourselves so that we can share that with the person that we're with. And vice versa, right? We need them to be able to learn something that works for them too. So, I feel like it might be a good idea for us to talk a little bit about what's going on in the body. Like, what is it about sex that makes it so good? So, often I generally kind of think of sex as kind of recess for adults. Now I recognize that not everybody enjoyed recess as kids, so I've been challenged on that to kind of think about it a bit differently. But essentially, it's meant to be fun. It's meant to be playful. It's meant to be pleasurable. It's meant to be enjoyable. That's really biologically what it's designed for, other than the reproductive stuff. But I generally feel like that's secondary. But it's really supposed to be pleasurable, and that's the goal. We want it to feel good. We want it to feel good for both parties. Understanding a little bit about what's going on in the body, this is why it feels good. So we get a release of endorphins, so natural opiates. So a natural high, we don't necessarily have to use additional drugs to support that. Endorphins start pretty much at the very beginning, so they're part of the arousal, the attraction process. Oftentimes you're also going to kind of see that even throughout, once we kind of reach orgasm, when there's a huge rush of endorphins, you might feel dizzy or drowsy, you might even drift off to sleep, so we get a huge release of endorphins after any kind of orgasm that we might experience. So if you are the type of person who does fall asleep, or you're ferociously hungry, that might be a little bit what's going on. One of the two tends to happen. One thing that's kind of interesting is that some of the research has kind of suggested that overstimulation of the opioid receptors, so when we see this similar with heroin use, causes a depressed sex drive. And so this is one of those pieces where, if we're running into sex addiction, where people who are engaging in sexual activity so much, they'll actually notice that they are no longer interested or desiring sex, which can be a problem, especially if they're in a relationship. Epinephrine is another one that we get, so this is kind of the adrenaline rush that we get, activates the nervous system and sends blood to where it needs to be to support the sexual activity that we're having fun with. So that's pretty important. Dopamine. So dopamine is interesting because it's actually present throughout our whole sexual experience. So the time of interest, kind of noticing somebody, seeing them, all the way through to orgasm. It's constantly on the go there. One of the things about dopamine is also, it's connected to the pleasure center in our brain, but it's also connected to newness. So what's new, what's exciting, and what's interesting. So when we're looking at kind of pleasure and sexual interest and what keeps things from not being boring, part of this is stimulating dopamine. So we have to be very mindful of, if sex becomes too predictable, A plus B equals C, then what happens is that dopamine rush doesn't happen as much. And so that's when we kind of lose interest, or you're kind of putting together a grocery list during sexual activity or different things like that. Which is never good, right? Never good. Nobody ever wants that. The other thing about dopamine is that, again, when we're kind of looking at pornography, one of the challenges that can come is that most of us, if we're looking at pornography, unless we're watching videos, but nowadays you're kind of looking at multiple images or clips online very quickly, we can change what we're looking at so quickly with the click of a mouse or scroll through multiple images that we're getting hit after hit after hit after hit of dopamine. And so that then makes real life, real sexual experiences with other partners not nearly as exciting. And so that's again something that we kind of have to be mindful of in terms of raising our tolerance. I kind of consider it's like any other tolerance that we raise, we've got to bring it back to a baseline to enjoy some of those things that are kind of on a more organic level, for lack of a better word. So some of the other kind of big culprits, testosterone. So something that exists in both men and women and is actually needed for sexual desire and drive in both men and women. So if this is low in either party, then that certainly can affect how much they're interested in kind of pursuing sexual activity of any kind. Generally speaking, most people though who are experiencing a low desire or interest in sex, often it's rarely linked to testosterone. So that's one of the first things that we'll say is go get that checked out just to make sure. But oftentimes it's a lot of other stuff that's going on that's impacting that. Serotonin, I think most people know what serotonin is. So this is kind of a mood regulator, but it's also kind of the happy, feel-good hormones. So again, we get a huge release of that during, typically this one starts getting released more during sexual activity, so kissing, touching. It will start as early as kissing, and then again, we kind of get a big rush more towards the end. The last one is oxytocin. So oxytocin, you might have heard of, it's known as kind of the bonding chemical or the cuddling hormone. Oxytocin is something that makes us feel close to the person that we're with. We feel kind of more, I guess, bonded or emotionally close. During orgasm, this is released quite a bit. It's also released earlier on in terms of kind of kissing, touching, different things like that. Interestingly enough, for women, this is something that is typically released more throughout, I guess, the relationship. So you can be sitting next to them on the couch, they might get a release of that. You know, you guys are having fun, they might get a release. Men also will have some of that, but they're more inclined to experience a higher dose or a higher release after sex or orgasm. And so with that, it's kind of one of the interesting things, because I'll sometimes hear from couples, you know, I will feel really close to you once we've had sex. Like, that's what makes me feel close. And then I'll hear from the other partner, I just really need to have a good time with you. I want to feel close to you emotionally. I want to feel like we're really connected, and then I desire sex. So sometimes it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. And it can be helpful to understand that part of that is probably linked to when that oxytocin is getting released that makes you feel close and connected. So this is why it feels good. In addition to this, and you guys might have heard of some of these things, so way back in the 1960s, Masters and Johnson, they did a huge amount of research on understanding kind of sex, sexual response, different things like that, and they kind of came up with this model of our general sexual response style. So we kind of have desire, and then we kind of have this arousal process, some kind of plateau, right, where we can kind of, you know, hold that, where there's kind of this play back and forth, and then kind of this idea of orgasm or multiple orgasm, which they added later on, and then we get kind of this relaxation, you know, kind of back to even state, so to speak. So this really helped understand what will kind of happen as we kind of reach that peak point. The only challenge with this is it also did, unfortunately, a very good job of creating this idea of A plus B equals C. I will do this, and then you will feel this way, and then I will do this, and then you will feel that way, and then we will reach this, you know, orgasmic place, and then we're done. The challenge with that is that, you know, sometimes we can enjoy sexual pleasure and sexual activity without reaching orgasm. You know, sometimes we do that, you know, without penetration. There's lots of different ways that we can experience sexual pleasure. So being able to kind of step away from this model, understanding it in terms of how the bodies work, but not necessarily having that in the back of our mind as this is the way it's supposed to be is important. Because understandably, this adds a lot of pressure to things, right? So I need to perform in a certain way, I need to maintain my arousal long enough for my partner so that we can come together in this kind of magical moment. So if we can kind of let go of some of those, I guess, expectations, we're a lot more free to just kind of play and experience sexual activity. So I might orgasm, and then we fool around, and then you do. Or, you know, you orgasm, and I don't. Or neither one of us do, because, you know, somebody knocks on the door and interrupts us, or any number of different things, right? So again, kind of having that variety piece is what keeps sex interesting and keeps us more in our bodies, which is ultimately key in terms of that pleasure. So more recently, 2001, there was some research done on a sexual response to style, a little bit more about how it relates to women. I would say it's not necessarily exclusively women, but this is more for anybody who that relational component is really important. So feeling close to emotionally, feeling connected, that becomes a part of their arousal cycle and arousal process that's needed in addition to that. So just kind of looking at the two cycles, what's interesting about this one is, as you can see, more or less it's a circle. And so what's nice about that is that there's no beginning and end point to it. It's kind of a constant feedback loop, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it. One of my profs when I was doing my sex therapy training talked about this idea that we're all in a constant state of arousal. You know, it's just a question of whether we're at a level 1 versus maybe a level 8. And so when we kind of think about this kind of feeds more into that in terms of how are we feeding that sexual excitement and that sexual energy. And that's important, especially in relationships, because there's definitely a difference of being good partners, getting along well, working well together, and feeding that sexual energy side of the relationship. And so that is something that ideally we want to be constantly feeding in different ways, ideally on a daily basis on some level, even if that's just, you know, a passionate kiss, right? So that's key. I show you both of these kind of response cycles to, again, let you know that there's not really a one way or a right or a wrong way. And that's one of the biggest things we're finding in a lot of the sex therapy research. The more we can let go of expectations of this is what it needs to look like, this is what it has to look like, the less problems we're seeing. We find less problems with desire, we find less problems with performance issues and different things like that. So key is kind of taking that pressure off. And when that pressure is not there, we're more or less kind of free to just play, and that makes a huge difference. And that kind of takes us to this. So what is good, healthy sex? So this is the stuff that I wish they covered in school. Maybe they are starting to, but it definitely wasn't covered when I was in school. So I don't know if it was for you necessarily. Number 1, above all else, this is pleasure driven. This is one system in the body that is very much about the pleasure. So understanding a little bit about some of those chemicals, we're not going to desire sex unless it is pleasurable, unless it is fun. It's just not going to happen. We can certainly be sexual without those components, but that ends up actually being very harmful. Because, again, we have to go back to that pleasure piece. I have to want to desire it for me to want to kind of seek that out. So, because it feels good for everybody, not just one person, right, but for everybody. That's important. And we'll talk a little bit more about consent. Good, healthy sex is also controllable energy, so it's not out of control. It's not kind of taking over everything else where I'm not seeing my friends and I'm not, you know, socializing with people, I'm missing work, different things like that. It's a controllable energy, but it's a part of who we are. It's choice, it's consensual, safe, it's responsible, and that kind of goes back to the idea of being controllable. So it's not reckless, it's not putting yourself in danger, it's not putting somebody else in danger. That's really important. It's mutual, respectful, honest, playful, and fun. Again, key. It needs to be playful, it needs to be enjoyable. And part of that play is also exploring, kind of discovering and figuring out who we are. Our bodies are constantly changing. I've worked with some clients where, you know, they've even just kind of had some kind of accident that's resulted in some pain injury where all of a sudden it's like, well, this part of my body hurts now to touch, and so now it's rediscovering where does that pleasure exist, how can we create that pleasure. People who are, might be in wheelchairs, who kind of lost the ability to kind of feel different parts of their body, different things like that, their ability to experience sexual pleasure doesn't go away. It's more just kind of discovering what's new and what's different. So that's important. Creative. So that's kind of part of, I guess, spicing it up, right? Being creative for both parties, kind of exploring that. Empowering, not focused on orgasm and outcome. So that's another key message. If you could take that away tonight, I feel like that will enhance your sexual experiences immensely. I'm not saying that orgasm is not enjoyable. Of course it is. You know, it's always fun to have as many as we can, but not necessarily having that as being the focus. Avoids that A plus B equals C. So not so routine that it's we do this, then we do this, then we do this. It also reflects your values. So what is important to you? You don't feel like you're compromising your values. You can feel good about what's happening, that that kind of fits with part of who you are. And it also has boundaries. So whatever those boundaries are, that you need to feel safe within that. So in order to have have good sex, in addition to kind of those things, we also need these essential elements. One, we need consent. Two, we need equality, respect, trust, safety, and communication. So rarely, when I meet with couples, and I ask how much of you guys talk with each other about what you're dealing with, in terms of sex and intimacy, and typically it's, well, we don't really talk about it. We might talk about it if it comes up, in an argument or a fight, but we generally avoid it. So communication is key in terms of being able to deal with any kind of challenges with sex and intimacy, and to get on the same page, we need to be able to talk about that. So we're going to start with kind of consent. That's probably the biggest thing, is making sure that we have consent. Consent has, basically, in consent, the person has the ability and freedom to choose whether or not to engage in sexual activity. So that seems fairly straightforward, but certainly consent, there's a lot of questions that exist about consent. I'm not even sure actually how long the video is, or like when it came out, but in the UK, I believe it was the police organization got together and they put together this educational piece on trying to clarify what consent is.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No thank you," then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea, don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they are unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea.
Anything surprising in that video? Anything that kind of sticks out in terms of consent?
People can change their mind about it.
Yes, people can change their mind. You can go to all the trouble to make the tea and they can still say, "No thank you, I've changed my mind." And that's really important because you can also change mind halfway through sexual activity. I might be okay kissing and making out, but somewhere along the way I might get uncomfortable, I might want to change my mind, I might want to stop. We could be in the middle of intercourse and I might be like, "This is painful, I want to stop," right? So at no point does that have to kind of continue until one person kind of reaches a point where they decide it's done, right? If a person wants to stop, it all stops. And I always kind of use the example, if you're kind of with somebody, you're kind of making out, things are hot and heavy, things are going really well, and all of a sudden your parents happen to stop by for a surprise visit, you're not going to be like, hey, mom, dad, I just need 5 more minutes, we'll finish this off, and then we'll come out and meet you, right? Things stop. Frustratingly so, but they stopped, right? Nobody, 0 person has ever had any major health problems or died because they had to stop sexual activity. So it certainly can be done. The other piece of that is that just because one person wants to stop, the other person does want to, kind of keep going, or they're feeling like, I want to do more. That's also something that they can either kind of go and take care of that need on their own, they can do that separately, or in some situations it might feel comfortable to watch your partner do that, or kind of be participatory in some way, right? But the key thing is it is okay to change your mind at any point and kind of bring things to a halt. And it's really important that we respect that, because if we don't, then we fall into that idea that now we've, created a negative sexual experience for one person, and that's going to very much affect how much they want to experience, sex and sex pleasure in the long run. The other piece of this, which I think is also a good point, is that people, whether we're in, kind of long-term relationships, or whether it's kind of a, we're just kind of hooking up with somebody for the night, other people are not responsible for meeting our sexual needs. We are 100% on the hook for that. We can all meet our own sexual needs in lots of different ways, independently, individually. And so we're not necessarily relying on another person or a relationship to do that. The only caveat that I add to that is in relationship, we do have to be careful about a balance. I always use the example, I had this very sweet couple that they came to see me, and they'd been married and were very committed to each other, but the male partner was experiencing issues with low desire. He just didn't really have a whole lot of desire. He was finding that when they would engage in sexual activity and kind of do some of the exercises we talked about in session, that desire, that interest wasn't kind of happening. He was having a hard time getting erection. And it must have been probably the 4th session when we were talking about different things. And he's like, I'm just curious, do you think it's affected at all by the fact that I masturbate every morning and every night? So it's just part of his thing. Get up in the morning, took care of things, go home after work, used it to relax. And so we're like, well, so that's, nothing wrong with it. It was good for him. But it definitely was kind of having a bit of a negative impact on the relationship. So we did a little experiment and said, okay, well, let's limit that self-pleasure to a couple times a week. The next time they came in, he's like, wow, this is amazing. I'm wanting this, I'm desiring this, I'm interested. And so that is something where, in terms of meeting our own sexual needs, when we're in a relationship, we're definitely responsible for that, but it's always good and important to kind of think about, am I choosing to be by myself, engaging in sexual pleasure, sexual fantasy by myself, at the expense of connecting with my partner, right? And so that balance is key, and that's a balance is important. Again, if there's too much pornography going on, we will see this, right? I've worked with a lot of people dealing with porn addiction where they will talk about things like, yeah, I just wait for my partner to go to bed, and in my mind I'm kind of planning, oh yeah, once they go to bed, then I'm going to go downstairs and get the computer out, and so they're looking forward to it, but they're planning their sexual excitement and their sexual pleasure outside of the relationship. And the challenge with that is then when their partners are wanting to engage, they're not interested. And so that's where we have to kind of be mindful of that balance, so to speak. Anything else about the video that stood out for you in terms of the consent? Yep.
I'm not really 14 now. Look, someone can do the teen, another person, I'm not really.
Yes. Yeah. One person might not be as interested in it in terms of you can't pour the tea. If they're, regardless of whether they're sleeping, they're passed out, they passed out during, any of those different things. Yeah, we can't pour the tea. That has to be kind of something that's mutually agreed upon. So not forcing that on somebody else. Yeah. Anything else anybody else would add? Anything else that kind of stuck out? No? So these are, kind of some of the other key things that I would, want to emphasize. When it comes to consent, it's the person initiating sexual activity. They're the ones who's responsible to make sure they have it, right? And so that's really important. Ideally, back and forth in an exchange, we're paying attention. Is this person engaged? Are they enjoying this? Am I enjoying this? So consent also can certainly flow back and forth. The person who initiates consent also gets to say, I'm done, or I want to stop, or I don't want to keep going. But definitely it's on you to make sure that you have consent. It's not up to the other person to make sure that. silence or the absence of no does not necessarily guarantee consent. And that's really important as well. Because if we're not really talking with each other, right, we might assume, well, you're coming along and you're going along. Can't guarantee that I necessarily have consent. That's important to, again, be paying attention to. Responsiveness as a result of pressure, coercion, threat, or intimidation is not consent. And this is really important as well, because sometimes I've worked, unfortunately, with a number of individuals that have said, I feel like I have to have sex in order to keep my partner happy. You know, if I don't have sex with them, then they're going to cheat, or they'll be dissatisfied, or they'll go somewhere else, or they might break up with me. They also might get that directly, you know, from partners who say, well, I don't understand, you know, I thought you loved me, if you love me, you would do this is no big deal. Or I've also kind of seen cases where they just kind of wear you down, right? So kind of like, how about now? Are you in the mood now? Are you in the mood now? How about right now? How about right now? And so again, that kind of wearing down, somebody kind of be like, okay, fine, let's just do this and get it done, right? Not consent. And not something we want. It's very, very detrimental, both to the individual and to the relationship. And what's interesting about that is I've had a number of partners who've also come in saying they don't want their partners to do that. They can tell the difference as well, right? They can tell they're not into it, they're not really engaged, it feels like, you know, they're just kind of lying there until I'm finished. So partners in healthy relationships are going to want you to enjoy and have pleasure in sexual activity as much as they are. So it's not necessarily good for either party. And if you're seeing that, somebody feels like they're not engaged, good to check in, good to kind of stop what's going on here. You know, we don't have to do this. That's really important to pay attention to. Yes, yesterday does not mean yes today. So I think that covered very nicely in the video. We need consent every single time. So even if you're together for 20 years, you do not get an all-access pass. You must get consent every single time, right? It's always a give and take. It's always a mutual back and forth, and that's really, really important. A clear, affirmative, freely given yes indicates consent. When I used to do sexual education presentations, you know, for high school students, I would often get a lot of questions around, well, how will I know? Like, how do I make sure that I have consent? I can tell you that you will 100% know. You will know when somebody's into something. You know when they're being responsive, when they're engaged, when they're present. You know, and you can trust that. So if you're doing these things and respecting those boundaries, when you kind of see like, oh, I'm not sure what's going on, I stop. You never have to worry about crossing somebody's boundaries. Any questions about any of that? In terms of consent, you all got it? Yeah. Excellent. So with that, there's also lots of reasons why somebody might not be in the mood for sex. So in long-term relationships especially, we have to learn how to navigate kind of different interests and desires at different times. So how do we gently kind of let the other person down, or kind of dealing with that rejection? So it can be also helpful to recognize that it's rarely about the other person. It's not about a lack of desire, lack of interest. It can be I'm not in the mood for sex because I'm, you know, stressed, I'm tired, I've got this big work deadline, I'm bored, Netflix. You know, I'm feeling alone or misunderstood. There might be a disconnection in the relationship. Some people, if they have conflict, sex is the last thing on their mind. Other people, they have conflict, let's have sex and make out. So it very much kind of depends on the person. Certainly there are some health conditions as well as medication side effects that can affect sexual interests. People are on antidepressants, for example, that can definitely have an effect on sexual desire. There are things that certainly in a relationship that you can kind of do to work around that to kind of facilitate desire in different ways. But definitely sometimes those are things that are at play, and it's helpful to just be aware of that, because generally we tend to go to that place and, well, it must be something about me that you're not desiring me, and that's rarely the case. So that equality and respect, we've kind of covered this. But I think this is kind of important. Again, we want it to be equal playing field. This is about both parties, both people. And that respect piece goes along. Trust is hugely important, right? We have to trust each other, and safety. It has to feel safe. So trust, honesty, understanding, appreciation, support, laughter, open communication, extremely important. Healthy boundaries, pardon? Things that we want to avoid, being overly critical, feeling trapped in a relationship, that's not a good sign. Any kind of physical violence or emotional violence or abuse. One person setting all the rules, right, feeling controlled by somebody, having a hard time connecting, or one person is ignoring consent, not respecting boundaries. That's obviously not components of a healthy relationship. When we kind of look at, there's a lot of research on healthy relationships, which is a good thing. And these are kind of some of the big people in the field. So when I'm working with couples, or even individuals on what is a healthy relationship, what does that look like, these are often kind of the research people who we go to. And what he found is he calls these guys the 4 horsemen. So if these 4 things are happening a lot in the relationship, then the research is consistent that the relationship is not going to last. And so this is something that we're often kind of looking for. Criticism, a lot of contempt, so attacking the self of the other person, disliking everything about them, speaking meanly about them, kind of venting to friends in a very destructive way. Defensiveness, so when you kind of go and try and talk to them, I'm bothered by this, or I'm upset by this, they're not open to having a discussion, they're very much blaming of the other person. Oftentimes with contempt, we kind of see that resentment, and we also will see even, I guess, hatred, for lack of a better word. Like, you just get this sense that you just can't even stand them. You've kind of lost the ability to see any goodwill in the other person. The last thing is stonewalling, and so that's basically withdrawing as a way to avoid conflict. So the type of person who refuses to have a discussion with you, they refuse to resolve things. So these are things that can exist in any relationship, but certainly we want to keep an eye on if this is becoming more and more prevalent, that means the relationship is really in trouble. So the other thing that Godman has done nicely is he's also kind of talked about, here's the things that make a relationship successful. Basically, trust, commitment, turning towards each other, seeing the best in each other, supporting each other's dreams and hopes and desires, creating shared meaning, right? So doing things together, kind of having rituals, connecting, doing thoughtful things for each other. Managing conflict is really important. So dealing with conflict, open to accepting other, influence on us. So we care about what they say, we care about what they think. That being said, we care, but it doesn't necessarily, we're going to kind of compromise what's important to us, but there's kind of this mutual give and take, this compromise, this shared understanding. We want to figure it out. We want to come to a solution or agreement that works for all parties. It's really what we're kind of looking for in terms of being able to build a positive and healthy relationship. And this is where he talks about in terms of we have to feed it. He's a great website, and people can kind of sign up for what he calls the Marriage Minute, Relationship Minute, where he kind of sends up different research and kind of tips on a weekly basis that people can sign up for. So I find this is often quite helpful. It gives a bit of a structure in terms of how do we communicate, how do we deal with conflict. So that's Godwin. The other thing that is really kind of unique and I think valuable in his research, what he's also found is there's kind of this 5-to-1 ratio. So for everything negative that happens in a relationship, we need 5 positive things to counteract that one negative thing. It's really helpful, and you can, I'm going to guess, extend this beyond that in terms of friendships, possibly even in the workplace. But that 5-to-1 is really important. So when we do make a mistake or we drop the ball, we're not there for somebody in the way that they need us, we hurt them in some way, in addition to kind of being accountable for that and apologizing, we also still need to have this 5-to-1 ratio. What he found in couples who are really, really kind of high in the 4 horsemen is that the ratio there is 0.8 to 1. So it's really low. So we want to make sure that we've got that 5-to-1 that's happening. 2 other people I just want to talk about quickly. Johnson is somebody who, what her research on relationships talks a little bit more about attachment and that emotional connection that's needed within relationships for both partners to feel connected and satisfied. And so one of her big things, she has many important things to say, but one of the big things that I find very helpful is what she calls ARE, are you there? And so what she finds is that in relationships, we need our partners to be accessible to us, right? So can I reach you? Do I matter to you? When I'm needing you, are you there? Can I count on you? In addition to accessibility, we also need responsiveness. So can I depend on you? Will you come when I call, right? So not only do you care, are you there, but can I count on you to also be there with me through whatever's happening, whatever's going sharing is also kind of big in terms of sharing feelings. I can't tell you the number of clients I've worked with where I'll hear one party in the couple say, I just want to know what you're thinking. I just want to know what's in your head. I just want to know what you're thinking. You know, what's going on? What do you feel? What are you interested in? What do you like? So that sharing piece, that responsive piece is extremely important in terms of that engagement.